Everyone, this is the Innovator's Mindset with Erik Francis. There we go, my guy. All right. You just missed out on the best podcast never recorded. Just happened there. You spent basically 2 hours talking about wrestling and 80s references and just getting to know Erik. And I've known Erik forever. He is brilliant, brilliant educator. Erik did some really incredible things in education. And I know that everyone that listens to this is really going to benefit from what they can do in their classroom. So Erik, before we get into anything, and I ask you some questions. So
Yeah.
Erik, if you could just tell everyone who you are, what you do today, how you got there, it's a great place to start.
Awesome, awesome. I'll try to keep, the origin in a nutshell. I've been an educator for about going on 30 years now. I was an English teacher. I was a site administrator. I was not an successful administrator, man. I am the perfect reason and example why people need coaching and support when you're an administrator.
Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like you're thrown into the job and you're like, okay, here's the job. Don't make mistakes because we'll hold them against you. And just also, I think even my ego and pride, I'm like, I don't know if I was ready, and I didn't know if I really even after the great learning thing about it was that, I realized this is what I wanted to do. This is not the path I wanted to take, which is interesting because I thought it was the path I wanted to take and it wasn't. So then I went to the state education agency out here in Arizona where I learned about policy and law.
Mm.
And then 2012, somebody put a bug in my ear saying you should consult. So that's when I decided to break out on my own. I formed Maverick Education,
Mm.
Maverick. It's named after my daughters, Madison and
Aw,
Avery. It's my name.
I love that.
And, my favorite movie's Top Gun. So, which is really cool because when we go out to conferences and everything, people go, "Hey, Maverick." And it's like my inner 15, 16-year-old, like, all right, cool, I'll take that. And then I just started writing books, man. And my first book in 2016 was Now That's a Good Question. And then I took a little break because that was such an interesting process. And then the pandemic hit, and I said, well, I got nothing else going on, so I'll write my next book. And that's when I wrote my book on DOK, depth of knowledge. And I didn't want to write a book about what is depth of knowledge. I wanted
Yeah,
to write a book on what you can do with depth of knowledge. Like I didn't create depth of knowledge. I'll be the first to admit it.
yeah.
But what I did with it was turn it into something that teachers can understand and use to, not only understand what those rigorous expectations are, but use the standards so our students can rise to reach and go beyond those expectations. And then I went back and, went back to the questioning route because what I wrote in 2016 was my thinking in 2016. But, we grow and we learn.
Right.
And my thinking evolved. And it's still a good book. It's still, what accepted well and it sells well.
Yeah.
But my thinking has changed. So I wrote Inquiring Minds Want to Learn. So now that's a good question of what are the questions we can ask? But Inquiring Minds Want to Learn is these are how you pose these questions to engage the kids to not only comprehend but also communicate their learning.
It's interesting because I always think of this right now because you're obviously doing some work that's really important to you right now, and then you look back at 2016, that work is really important to you now, and then you've grown from it, and then what are you going to think 10 years from now based on what you're talking about today, right? And that's something that always kind of baffles me because if you are 10, 20 years into teaching and you aren't a little bit ashamed of your first couple of years, then you probably haven't grown that much, which is like a little bit of a scary thing. Like you should grow through that process. There's something you said. I'm like really interested in this because I really enjoy teaching. I think I was a good teacher, but I felt like I was a way better administrator. And I think sometimes people say, you can't be an effective administrator because if you aren't a great teacher. And I would actually challenge that because, and I know that you're really into sports as well, that they're some of the best players in any sport are the worst coaches ever, right?
Hmm.
And it's like it's not always connection. But do you think that because I'm sure you had an amazing career as a teacher and to struggle with the administrator, do you think you could actually have had not a great and been a good administrator? Are those connected at all, or is it like two totally different skill sets in your mind?
I think it's a different skill set. Like,
Yeah,
look, I looked at being an administrator, being an instructional leader,
yeah.
and I was anything but.
Mm.
Okay, I was a cop without a badge. I used to use my grandfather's NYPD interrogation techniques to catch who skipped out a fourth hour and and who made a mess out of the bathroom.
Right.
I know where your eyes roll. I know, when the tips of your ears turn red, you're lying to me.
Yeah.
And I was able to, be that. It's also about being a politician. It's that do you know how to go through,
Mm.
uncharted waters or rocky waters? And I'm not good at that. I mean,
Yeah.
George, you and I, know each other. We had a long conversation, but I'm very vocal. I'm very
Yeah.
outspoken. And sometimes, when I say things, it's not politically correct.
Mm.
It's not, it's
Not
not.
swearing on podcasts though.
Yeah, well, that's fine. But no, but it's honest. It's true. Like I'm not a bobblehead. I'm not, when Adam Grant talks about in the book Think Again about being the politician,
Mm.
where how can I get you to like this so you like me? No, I mean my saying is this is that look, if it looks like crap and it smells like crap, then it's crap and you better do something about it or it's going to turn into furniture and then you're really going to have a problem. And that's the thing is that I think that's where I failed. I also think about my own ego and hubris. I let the title get to my head.
Yeah.
I was the assistant principal. I had some power with it. But really, I wanted to be an instructional leader.
Yeah.
And that's actually the thing is that what's your niche? Who are you? Like I see, it's funny when we talk about coaches because I see a lot of people who say, because you're a good teacher, you're going to be a good
Right.
instructional coach. And that sometimes doesn't work that way. And I've seen people who were horrible teachers and they are the greatest administrators
Yeah.
because it's just about, why you are, how you are, who you are, what's your skill set. So I was a great teacher. I think I was a great teacher. My kids told me no, I don't think I was a good teacher. My kids tell me I was a great teacher. People tell me I was a great
Right.
teacher. It's like that Walter Payton saying,
Right.
show them how good you are and let them tell you how great you
Exactly.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I think I was good with that. But well, it's funny because we also talked about a conversation off, like what got us into doing what we were doing. Like you were, you wanted to write and then you started to speak, right?
Yeah.
I started speaking, but I was speaking from the lens of being a teacher of teachers. I wanted to teach teachers strategies on how they can be not just to be more effective, but to enhance their instruction.
Yeah.
And then someone approached me and said, "Hey, you want to write a book about this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure."
Mm.
So I think that's the thing. It's really knowing what kind of leader you are and knowing who you are. And yes, there's a pathway, but what's the pathway you want to take? And is that the pathway you want to go? So kind of circling back to what you were saying is that I think you got to look at your skill set, and I think you're also got to look at your will and your want. If you want to be a leader, fine. Do you want to be the leader who is more disciplinary or more organizational? Well, then there's a track for you. If you want to be more the instructional leader, you got to figure out how to find that track and find your way.
Well, then you talk about, in your book about posing good questions, and you even look at that. You can't really do that effectively if you don't actually reflect on your own practice. And so I appreciate your vulnerability and talking about some of those things that you learned through that process because it's really hard to listen to somebody talk about learning and growing and asking good questions if I don't see you doing it. And so I really
Mhm.
appreciate that you look back at some of the stuff that you've done, how you've grown from it. I guarantee you that if you went into it now, you would have a totally different frame on how you would approach it. And that is one of the things for me is that if you really want to be effective moving forward, you have to look back. You have to really kind of appreciate that. Now you do a lot of stuff with depth of knowledge, and people that maybe listen to this podcast might not have heard of this work. And so if someone who's totally new to this has never heard it or framed it, what does that look like? What is this like? How do I and I don't want to say implement in a classroom because you and I talked about this. You can't like, hey, I heard this about for 3 minutes and now I've done it just amazingly well right away. But like, just maybe if someone wants to start looking at it, like what's the kind of the beginner intro to that for someone who's never heard of what depth of knowledge is?
I would say what distinguishes depth of knowledge, because there's a lot of cognitive frameworks out there. You got Bloom's, you got Solo, you got Marzano's, you got Fink's, and a lot of them talk about thinking. What distinguishes depth of knowledge is depth of knowledge clarifies what exactly and how deeply you have to think about or learn, and that is not about your teaching, it's
Yeah.
about students learning. Like I tell people all the time that they're teaching at deeper DOK levels. In fact, I go into schools and I say, look, teachers, you're all teaching at a deeper DOK level.
Yeah.
That's not the question. The question is, what's the level the kids are learning at? And more importantly, how do I really know that they learned it? Like I see a lot of kids, we talk about engagement and our kids are engaged, but I see a lot of kids on devices. I see them, going bip bop boop. I see them swiping left, swiping right. The joke I like to say is, are we teaching them how the subject, or are we teaching them how to use Tinder? And basically, how do I really know that they learned it? The true mark and measure of learning is whether you can comprehend it and communicate what you comprehend. That's what it is. Look, it's great you can know that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Mhm.
And it's great that you can basically tell me that 542 times 398 is 215,716. Don't be impressed because I have a phone that gave me that information. Okay. I just sent it in my calculator. But can I tell you how I got that answer? Can I justify why it's correct or incorrect? Can I consider, well, what if I flipped the factors? Or what if I mixed up all the numbers and I multiplied them? What would my answer be? What else can I do with what I've learned? So depth of knowledge clarifies and describes 4 different ways kids can comprehend and communicate their learning or demonstrate and discuss their learning. It's not like Bloom's,
Yeah.
because Bloom's all about the verbs, and that's thinking. But the problem with verbs is that it's abstract. So if I asked you, like, what does analyze look like, sound like, and feel like?
Yeah.
And what does that look like, sound like, and feel like in English versus math? You're analyzing, which is a higher level thinking, but what exactly are they analyzing and how deeply they have to analyze it? That's why you got to look at the words that come after that verb,
Hmm.
because those are the words that state what exactly and specify how deeply. And then what I did with it, because again, I didn't invent depth of knowledge. Norman Webb created it.
Yeah.
It was a criterion for alignment studies. You check your standard, you code it 1, 2, 3, or 4. You check your activity assessment items 1, 2, 3, or 4. And you see how closely. I turned it into a concept that clarifies cognitive demand, what exactly, how deeply. It's a framework that allows you to tier instruction based on the demand of the standard. You start with the
Yeah.
standard, understand by design, and you tier to where the kids are, find out where they are, and bring them back to, through, and beyond that bar.
Mhm.
That way, all kids can succeed or have the feeling of success. And I also turned it into a language that really specifies what does learning look like, sound like, and feel like through the lens of the learner. And that ties it back to Hattie with visible learning.
There's a when people, and this is a reality of education, is that you have people say like, "Hey, there's too many standards, there's too much to get through, and I like have to get through this curriculum." And one of the things that I've said is that you getting through the curriculum and students learning the curriculum aren't on the same timeline necessary. Like the first, it should be, and that kind of ties into what you're talking about. It's like really what is being learned, not necessarily what is being taught, because those are
Mhm,
two different timelines.
mhm,
It's interesting that you bring up Patty, and I'm like, I'm curious of. There's a lot of like, hey, this improves learning, or this thing improves learning, and some of my concerns on when I hear that statement is that are they talking about learning or retention and regurgitation on a test? Because I don't necessarily like that's really hard to say like this one thing that learning improved. But how are you measuring that? Like when I look at all the Hattie stuff, how is that really measuring learning or how kids do well on a standardized test? Like I'm always curious about that. What are your thoughts on that? Because I don't necessarily think it's always measuring learning as much as it is measuring retention, and those are not necessarily the same thing.
I think when you look at it is that it's how they can learn it, or
Right.
more so even how you can teach it. One of the things
Right.
Hattie says, and I've become really a big, um, proponent and fan of Hattie.
Yeah.
And one of the things I also try to do, George, is that look, I don't invent anything. I just innovate it. I always say, okay, here's this. That's how I came up with good questions in the first place, because we all talked about essential questions, and I'm like, well, what's an essential question? And I realize it depends upon who you read, because Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins say this, and Ted Sizer, who came up with it, says this. And if you look at John Larmer with project-based learning, he says it's the driving question. So I said, okay, they're all good questions. So what does a good question do? So when you talk about that, tie it back, it's not so. What I really like what Hattie says is that, to paraphrase it, everything works, but everything doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
And I think that is actually what brings me joy as a professional development provider because I differentiate my PD.
Mm,
I don't want you to try to be Erik Francis, God forbid. And I don't want you to try to teach like me. And again, that goes back to the instructional coaching.
yep,
Don't go in and say teach like me. My job is to say this is what exactly needs to be learned. How deeply do you have to learn it? And how deeply you have to learn it? How could you learn it?
yeah,
That brings me the joy as the teacher. That brings me a joy. And if people think, well, professional development is different than teaching, it actually isn't. The only really difference is that my students are older and
right,
they're more set in their ways.
yeah,
And I have to differentiate to meet that. And I think that's when we get to that is that we're looking for that quick fix, that solution, and there isn't.
oh,
And I hear people talk about this all the time, like, well, the effect size of this is this. I mean, what does that mean?
right, right,
I mean, to me, it's kind of like, I always say it's like Robin Williams in Dead Poet Society. I give Byron a five, but I can't dance to it. So the thing is that is this benefiting the child? I
right.
mean, can I share a story about when I just worked with a
Please,
kid?
yeah,
Yeah. I was walking through a classroom and I was working with this student and they were multiplying decimals.
hmm,
And he turned to me and he says, I know how to do this. I can't do it the way the book is telling me how to do it. So I said, okay, how do you do it? Show me and share with me what you did. So the problem was 1.7 times zero point 0.2,
hmm,
and he got 3.4. And this is how I talked to him. I said, okay, so here's the deal. You're correct in how you multiplied 17 times 2, but what's going on with that decimal?
yeah,
And the kid said, oh, I'm adding, I'm not multiplying because when you add, you just bring the decimal
yep,
down. But when you multiply, it's how many, places after the
yep,
decimal. That's how many you have in your product. And I said, okay, good. So you understand that. Now, what I want you to do is take the way in the book and proof it that you're correct. What I just did, George, is I just took that child from a DOK1 where they just had to do the math
yep,
to a DOK2 where they explain to me how the math is done or how they understand it to a DOK3 where they're using a different way to justify why they're correct and incorrect. And look how much time that took.
yeah,
So again, what I think with visible learning, the power of visible learning is that it gives you all these things to create a tool belt
yep,
that says, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Now, the effect size is this, but the effect size is not 100%.
right,
It's
right,
always a decimal that's less than 100 from what I've read about
yep,
it. And it works with these kids. So if questioning, I think questioning is like a 0.85 if I don't memorize the numbers. But then what's that 0.15 that can't do it? That can't
right.
do it with that technique. What do I need to do? That's true differentiation and individualization.
Love that. And that is actually something I always try to say to people is that if you say to me, this works 90% with 90% of our students, my first question is, what are you doing for the other 10?
Oh
Because
yeah.
we're missing something there too. And you mentioned the importance of asking good questions. I think this ties in beautifully to your book, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn. Is that like the Inquiring Minds? What is that from? Like,
Inquiring minds want to know, which
what
is
is that?
really funny.
What
It was
is
a
that?
National Enquirer. That was their
That's
ad
what it is.
campaign.
Is when
Did
I read it,
Travis
I'm
did
like,
Travis Kelsey
why
just
did I?
break up with Taylor Swift? Inquiring minds want to know. I want
Yeah.
to know.
That's what I was
You
like. As
know
soon as I read it, I was like, did I just read it like an '80s TV ad? Like that's like the Inquiring Mind. Is that
that.
that's
Well,
what the
that's
National Enquirer?
yeah, that's the plan. Like George would be like this. Like, how did George Couros lose all that weight and get so buff?
Inquiring
Inquiring
Mind.
minds, Sydney Inquirer. I mean that's what it is.
I love it. Okay, so
Yeah.
probably you and I are the only people that know the National Enquirer like that commercial. So
Nah, they
kudos
can
on
Google it.
you. So tell us a little bit about your book and why it matters so much in what we're doing in schools today.
The question is basically how can you phrase and pose good questions that not only assess learning but address learning?
Hmm.
And questioning is hard. And I like to say questioning is a gift, but it's also a blessing and a curse. Like people who know me, they know that's how I learn. I ask questions, and that's what it means to have an inquiring mind. That you can hear something, see something, say, and you say, "Ooh, I have a question about that." Like that's how you and I got talking because I started seeing certain things you were saying in your posts, and we get an impression of something, or we
Yep.
get an understanding of someone, and then it's like, okay, wait a minute, what's really going on there? So see how that question, or like maybe, what if I'm wrong?
Yeah,
And that's actually what led us to talking and connecting the way we were because I realized, wow, am I wrong? Which is the greatest question you can ask.
absolutely.
Okay. And I was, and I'm glad that's why we talked for 2 hours before this fully trained. Oh, if you guys ever saw the deep cuts and the special
I'm
features of
good.
George thing. Yeah. So the thing is this. Questioning also makes it more about the student than the teacher. Because when we ask questions, we're primarily assessing. But what if we can shift that to say, this is what you need to address? So, what if I pose the question to class? And I used to do this in my class where I would have the question of the day. And it wasn't me assessing your learning. I mean, I did assess you formatively and summatively with it, but this is what we're going to establish, examine, and explore. Again, going
Yep.
back to the 4 DOK levels, what they can do. So, and we need to stop pressuring ourselves to say, I need to ask that good question.
Hmm.
It's not the question we ask, it's what we do with it.
Right.
So, if George, if I said to you this, what is 2 + 2? You would say what?
4.
And I say, you're right, but why?
Mm.
That's the
What way you
important
answer
learning.
that?
Yeah, well, that's the important learning. But see how
Yeah.
that deeper
Yeah.
learning
Yep.
is? And
Yep.
then I go, could 2 + 2 = 5? You would say what?
I saw some a video of it, and there's someone like blew my mind with how they proved that 2 + 2 can equal 5 in the way that they did it. So I'm like a little
And
bit curious
that's
about that. Yeah,
and that's the thing. But
yeah,
but you're doing it because we're off put by questions
yeah,
because we think, boom, we got to give an answer.
yep,
And that's assessment. That's testing.
yep,
Not even assessment, that's testing. Okay. That we're taught in school, teacher asks you a question, not only you better answer it, but you better be correct, or you're going to get the look down the glasses or
right,
the disapproval.
right,
That's why kids don't ask questions and they don't answer them. They don't want to be wrong. They
yep,
don't want to be right. Okay. But this gets you thinking. So when I ask you 2 + 2 = 5, and you told me no, and I'd say, okay, you're right, but why? And you go 2 + 2 = 4. Why? Because when I have two and two and add it together or put them together, I make 4. What would I need to make 5? Add one more. Okay. Now, what if I use addition, decimals, and rounding? Could 2 + 2 = 5?
hmm
That requires you really think strategically. And also, it's not about the answer. It's about, do I understand the concept and process of addition, decimals, and rounding where I can think critically and creatively about how 2 + 2 could equal 5?
You're. Is it one of the things that you when we were talking before that really stuck out to me was, and I'm going to ask you about it in a second about what you talked about the importance of like what you're focusing on for the future of education.
Mhm.
And as you're, I see this a lot, and like we're pretty plugged into lots of stuff online and social media and kind of what goes on. And a lot of people, I think, make statements right away without stepping back and asking questions, like about world
Mhm.
events or whatever. And it's like there needs to be that curiosity about something, like, and you said it earlier that like, hey, am I wrong about something? What am I missing here? And that, I think, one of the most important abilities in our world today is the ability to actually slow down and ask questions,
Mhm.
not just
Mhm.
try to like jump to something, because like it's way easier to like make a statement without asking the question, and then you really
Mhm.
don't understand it. And this really intrigued me when you talked about this, and you mentioned 5 C's when you're talking about the future of education. Can you kind of just go through that? Because I actually think what you share is very unique to what I often hear when people talk about the future of education, but I think yours is, very robust. And when you said it, I don't think it's limited to the next 10 years, right? I think
Mhm.
it's at any point.
Thank you.
Like if we were talking, having this conversation 10 years from now, I'm sure you could articulate those 5 C's again, but
Mhm.
they could be the same, but also change the way that, we look at the world. So give us like a quick overview when you talked about that with me earlier, what that was.
Well, now you got me thinking and questioning because now you talked about curiosity, and I'm thinking, should I add
Sure,
that
yes.
to the list? Yeah, because curiosity is a big thing.
Yeah.
Curiosity, and I think curiosity ties more so to even care. So, like,
Mhm.
let's say, for example, like how you and I connected and
Yep.
reconnected. All
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
I'd see something with you on social media. You'd say
Yeah.
something, you do something, and it got me curious. And you said something, and again, when that's between us, and I'm like, you know what? I may be wrong about this. Where am I wrong? Am I wrong about even my perception of George Couros? Now, do I care enough to go follow up on
Yeah.
that? Do I
Yeah.
care enough to go learn? And that's, I think, the big thing with kids. Are we getting them to care enough to want to learn. I mean, one of the things I say is, do you wake up every morning wanting and willing to learn something new? And some people who have that mindset said yes, but most people say no. And I said, well, you know what? We've required these kids to wake up every morning wanting and willing to learn something new 5 times a week for
Yeah.
180 days. What are we doing to get them to care? Why is this important? So for me to say the curiosity, I saw something about you, I care enough to go and delve deeper and say,
Mhm.
why may I be wrong? I want to learn that. So then what you do is you want to then comprehend. And this is where a lot of things I think where the disconnect's coming out, especially with technology, is that we've gone from a world where answers were we can attain answers easily by Googling it, and now we can have them explained to us. But do we really understand what they're saying? Are we taking the time to understand what they're saying? And then you also have to be able to communicate it. That's the big part. Can you
Mhm.
communicate it in your own words? Can you also consider what else? How
Right.
else?
Right.
And can you also critique and be honest? And I don't mean just critique externally, critique
Yeah. Yeah.
internally. So like
Well,
when we talk about our connection with it and how we reconnected, is that I had to be bold and humble enough and have that, curiosity, care to comprehend, to critique myself and say, you know what, I may be wrong, or I may be off base, or I may be
yeah.
seeing something and to tell you the truth, George, that's the secret behind deeper learning. It's not the thinking where it's categorized in a taxonomy. It's not the Bloom's level. It's not the DOK level. What are the 4 different ways the kids can do it? It's what are we getting the kids to go through that process? And I always say, and this is the thing about my work, because my work's always like, oh, Eric, you're about rigor, and we're not focused on rigor. We're focused on, relationships and how to, well, you got to teach the head and you got to teach the heart.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's like the question needs to be these days, how can we teach them by reaching them and how can we reach them by teaching them? So my question is, we're trying to get these kids engaged and curious, but what are we doing to get them to care
Hmm.
so they can comprehend and they can communicate, but they also can think deeply by considering what else or how else or
Yep.
and also critiquing, you know what? I may be wrong and that's
Yep.
okay. Or
I
what
love,
this is wrong. That's okay.
and I love that. And I think that is like a lot of time we do have to look internally on, how we think of things, what are perspectives. I wrote this post a while ago. Can like AI teach you empathy? And the short answer is no. But
Mhm.
it might actually, like, I remember throwing in a blog post into it that I wrote that I don't know if I should necessarily wrote. And I said, and I was like a little, felt some discomfort. I'm like, should I post this? And then I just threw it in ChatGPT. I said, "What am I missing here?" And I was like, "This, this, and this." And it was like interesting because it provided me perspectives that I hadn't even considered. And
Right.
I think that's so. Like, can it actually teach you empathy? No, but can you actually leverage it to get at different perspectives and actually internalize that? That is
Right.
something that I think is really powerful. Now, this is this. I know we're over time here. This is if anyone's lasted this long, the podcast. People like, always go out. Now this is I gotta ask you 2 questions. Okay.
Okay.
Favorite wrestler of all time. If anyone's here, okay, this is you can still stay. Favorite wrestler of all time, greatest wrestling match of all time. I'm like curious what you're gonna say. Because we have like
Well,
we
I got,
kind of grew up in the same era. And we
you
both
know, it's
love wrestling.
funny. Narrowing it down. Can I narrow it? Do I have to narrow it down to one or
What
can I
is the
make those
first
three?
match you think of? I got one like it is my
Oh my
favorite one.
gosh. Well, because we talked about it. My favorite wrestler is Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff.
Love Paul Orndorff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we talked about this because it's really funny. That's how we kind of clicked. And it's like, that's the part about the comprehensive communication piece and the
Yeah.
care is that you and I were talking about this and we both at this like referenced the same
Same
match
match. Same match.
where Hulk Hogan and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff teamed up against Big John Studd and Kid Kong
King
Bundy,
Kong Bundy.
and there was tension over the weeks, and it was building. And then at the end, the good guys won, and they held, and Hogan was beat up, and Orndorff held up his hand, and they cut to Stud and Bundy and,
Yeah.
and Bobby Heenan, and all of a sudden they cut back, and Orndorff just clotheslined him with that
Clothesline.
that tree trunk of an arm. That
Never
always
forget.
stays. I mean, everyone talks about when Hogan slammed Andre. They
Yeah.
talk about Savage dropped the elbow on DiBiase to win. They
Yeah.
talk about when the Warrior won in beat Hogan in
Yeah.
in Ontario. And no, to me, that's the match that always sticks in my mind.
There, that I actually can tell you, it's funny how much I remember. I can remember it was wherever when I lived in Saskatchewan. That was 9 to 10. I called my buddy Jay at 10 a.m. I could tell you his phone number to this day that I called, and just thinking about how different a time that is. My favorite, probably like Macho Man. Orndorff, I really liked Macho Man, Steamboat, WrestleMania 3. It's like
Oh
best
yeah,
match of all time. That is like
yeah.
one of my
Well,
favorites.
that set the
Yeah,
that basically innovated what wrestling is
yeah,
today.
it was
You know,
unbelievable. Unbelievable. One of the coolest things ever, that match. So
yeah, I mean, if you can say like the two things that really innovated wrestling today was, the match between Steamboat and Savage,
yeah,
but also the matches between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart,
yeah,
because you saw that real athleticism, which is kind of interesting because now a lot of the criticism, we're both wrestling fans, is that more people are looking for those antics,
yeah,
and they're not focusing on story. They're not
yeah,
focusing on the why. And that's actually a larger thing. And I
yeah,
think it's really funny, even like going to something like pro wrestling, is that we really need to focus on our why,
yeah.
but also focus on the just cause for what we do to bring people forward. So yeah.
So for the wrestling fans, there's that little wrestling. Erik, it was really great talking to you, and I hope people, and you can actually get a link to Erik's book, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn. You can also click on his author profile. You'll see other stuff that he talked about as well. But thanks so much for being on the podcast. I hope people connect with you. You can see Erik's socials down below. But thanks so much for being on the podcast, taking time to chat with me today. I'm super late for my next meeting, but I really appreciate you being here today.